How the Jews Betrayed Mankind. Volume 1, The Sumerian Swindle, 2nd edition by G_D, Chapter 4, The Sumerians and the Beginning of Civilization. During the 3,000 years before the birth of Christ, there flourished in Mesopotamia one of the most enduring and significant civilizations which the world has known. Its chronological extent very much exceeded that of the ancient Hebrews, while the mass of texts which survive are at least 20 times longer than the whole of the Old Testament. This mass of texts from Mesopotamia were buried for 5,000 years beneath the rubble of their abandoned and destroyed cities. Written on clay tablets that were baked into impervious bricks, the cuneiform writings of these long-vanished civilizations were not translated until the later part of the 19th and the beginnings of the 20th centuries AD. These ancient documents contain the proof that the Jews have been telling lies for the past 2,500 years. Modern Western civilization has been very much affected by the fables of the Jews simply because we have not had access to the original cuneiform records and have had to rely upon the fraudulent Jewish writings. When you only get one side of a story, what else can you do except believe the story for lack of any other view? And so, with their multitudinous prevarications and forgeries, the Jewish version of history has very much colored and twisted our ideas about the people and events in the ancient Near East. It is only through the modern work of archaeologists that a true picture of those ancient times has emerged. Long before the insignificant kingdoms of Judah and Israel were invented, great empires were established in the Middle East. The first of these were, of course, Sumeria and Egypt, beginning sometime before 3000 BC. It should be noted that what we know of those ancient times has only been discovered in the past 150 years or so. Although the Old Persian script had been deciphered by 1840 AD, it has been the accumulated knowledge found not only in the Assyrian and Sumerian royal archives, but also in the stone inscriptions and papyrus writings of the Egyptians that give us a more balanced picture of those times, a picture that is far more accurate than can be found in the slanders and fictions that the Jews wrote in the Old Testament. Digging through the ancient rubble of destroyed cities, the archaeologists of today have been able to piece together the history of those long-vanished civilizations using the actual records left by those people. And that history is very much different than what is found by the plagiarized Old Testament myths of the Jews. We must listen to what those ancient people had to say about themselves before considering the fables of the upstart Jews and their self-serving mythological fantasies. Although the peoples, whom we call the Ubaidians, first began the Mesopotamian culture, the real credit for establishing civilization goes to the Sumerians. Because their agglutinative language group resembled that of the peoples from south of the Caspian Sea, they may have originally immigrated from that area. But according to their own tradition, they came from the south. In the Sumerian language, Subar means north, Elam means east, Amaru means west, and Sumer means south. And so, as a people from the south, they were called Sumerians. They entered Mesopotamia gradually sometime between 3200 and 3100 BC, when the open sea of the Persian Gulf was 250 kilometers, or 155 miles, further north than it is today. They soon became the masters of the entire region. Modern archaeologists claim that they probably came from the Iranian plateau, and so would have an Aryan origin. The records that they left show that the Sumerians were an intelligent people with common sense and a pragmatic view of life. They prized wealth and possessions, farms filled with rich harvests and many cattle, successful hunting in the outback, bursting granaries, and nets full of fish. Their many legal documents show that they were very conscious of their personal rights and were not shy about dragging into the law courts those who encroached upon those rights. And their literature shows how much they valued honor and recognition and prestige and preeminence. What they brought to the existing culture of the Ubaidian landowners and Sumerian workers was an acute intelligence that allowed them to take the pre-existing inventions and ideas and improve upon them. The earliest names of Mesopotamian kings were Sumerian names. They so dominated every aspect of Mesopotamian life that the Sumerian language became the only language spoken. and they are credited with the invention of writing, since it was during their dominance that this technology achieved its full potential from a mere accounting method to a full functioning technology for transmitting and recording human thought. With writing and the use of written mathematical calculations, the Sumerian swindle was perfected. The simple interest of the Ubadians was supercharged into the grand larceny known as compound interest. Both simple and compound interest are swindles. Yet, with writing the numbers on wet clay, compound interest became an engine generating incredible wealth for those who controlled it, and great poverty and destruction for those who suffered under it. Although the entire Mesopotamian riverine region is deficient in most of the basic materials of civilized existence, such as hard timber, stone, and metal ores, even so, the Sumerians turned an agricultural community whose only three assets were water, sunshine, and mud into an advanced and literate culture. They devised such useful tools, skills, and techniques as the potter's wheel, the wagon wheel, the plow, the sailboat, the arch, the vault, the dome, casting in copper and bronze, riveting, brazing, and soldering, sculpture in stone, engraving, and inlay. Their cuneiform system of writing on clay was borrowed by other peoples and used all over the Near East for some 2,000 years. Almost all that we know of the early history of Western Asia comes from the thousands of clay documents inscribed in the cuneiform script developed by the Sumerians and excavated by archaeologists only in the past 150 years. Although the majority of early archaeology digs were commenced for the purpose of verifying biblical histories, it soon became apparent from both physical artifacts and cuneiform and hieroglyphic translations that the vast majority of Old Testament stories, that is, those Jewish fables that were not complete lies, were inaccurate at best. This past 150 years of archaeological digging around marks a period of enlightenment in our modern world. Until the archaeological remains of the Sumerians and the later Assyrians were dug out of the Mesopotamian dust, our only knowledge of those ancient people was what could be gleaned from a few paragraphs of excoriations and curses written about them in the Old Testament. What the West has known about a culture whose chronological extent much exceeded that of the Hebrew peoples by several thousands of years was close to zero. The Jews tell their stories from the religious bias that the cultures of the Sumerians and Babylonians and Assyrians and Egyptians were evil, while the culture of the Jews is pure and good. But rather than trust what the lying Jews have to say on the subject, we can see for ourselves from the cuneiform clay tablets what the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians wrote. This will help you to understand the great lies and evil frauds that the Jews have perpetuated upon all of mankind in this essential area of human faith and knowledge of God and history of man. Those readers who are atheists should be warned that just because this book shows the Jews to be liars, frauds, and swindlers, does not mean that religion itself is false. And those readers who are religious should be warned that this book in no way attacks your belief in God. But you will find that what you believe will be greatly altered and made much stronger even as your views undergo a change in perception. It may seem odd to the casual reader to begin a history of the betrayers of mankind with an essay on religion, but in order to understand the power that religion had on the ancient people as well as its uses in the modern political landscape, this is where we must begin. Please understand, especially you readers who have religious beliefs, that this history in no way is an attack against religious faith or belief in God. You will see from what follows that there is a God, and He is good, but that there is no God in Israel. Swig. The gods of Sumeria. For the Sumerians, everything good and holy began at the city of Eridu, E-R-I-D-U, located near the Persian Gulf. Although the Ubadians founded Eridu, it was the Sumerians who began their culture there. It was the Sumerians who wrote down the ancient stories and myths that had been committed to memory for 3,000 years and thereby became part of the culture of the Sumerians. So, it was written that all culture came forth from Eridu. Modern people have a variety of religions, atheistic ideas, agnostic ideas, as well as no ideas at all about religion. To a modern reader, it may seem odd to think about this, but you must understand that all of the ancient peoples were very religious. All of them believed in gods. All of them believed in the gods, and that's underlined. Regardless of whether you yourself believe in God or not, you must understand this. There were no atheists among the ancient peoples. They did not have our modern scientists' views of the universe, scientists who can see distant galaxies floating in empty space but who cannot see God. They did not have a modern scientist's quantum mechanical views of the universe, scientists who can theorize subatomic particles vibrating in yet more empty subatomic space, but who still cannot see God. They did not have the modern politician's view that their actions were immune to any power outside of their own abilities to cajole and persuade. To the ancient peoples, God and the gods were everywhere evident, controlling and always observant of the actions of man. Religion was the very basis of Sumerian life, and everything in their society revolved around their religious beliefs. The Sumerians asked the simple questions of religion such as, where did mankind come from? They did not have modern scientists lying to them and telling them that they had descended from monkeys. They looked about and honestly answered this eternal question and said, obviously, we were created by the gods. They asked other questions such as, what is the purpose of life? They did not have communists and capitalists and atheist Jews telling them that they were only animals who would do best by serving the corporate state as slaves and as mindless consumers of manufactured products. They answered this question with the only answer that made sense. The purpose of life is to serve God. Regardless of what the slandering rabbis claim about them, this and this alone was the primary guiding point for all of the various religions of Sumeria. From the poorest laborer to the mightiest king, everyone in Sumerian society began and ended their daily life in prayer to the gods, aware of mortal man's humble purpose in life. For what other purpose was man created but to serve the gods? What power could a puny and mortal man have against the thunderclap, the burning sun, the fierce wind, against disease, and especially against the cold inevitability of death? The Sumerians knew the answer to these questions and practiced their lives as a daily devotion to the gods. In the modern world, we try to make clear-cut distinctions between the various categories of fortune-telling, magic, religion, theology, and ethics. Such distinctions are not always easy to maintain, even in the modern world, and in ancient times, such distinctions would have been almost meaningless. In the ancient world, all these elements were part of one great whole. The transit of the sun, moon, and stars, the rains and winds, the heat of the day and the cold of the night, were all a part of the vast fabric of reality with which the Sumerians built their religion and their civilization. As members of one great entity, they communed with their gods through devotion, prayers, and sacrifice, and they received answers to their prayers through dreams, omens, direct conversations with God, and through priestly wisdom. A modern reader may scoff at the gods, but whether you believe in a god or not is really not important to this history. What is vitally important for you to understand is that the ancient people, each and every one of them, believed in the gods. To understand them and their culture and what their impact upon our own modern To understand them and their culture and what their impact upon our own modern societies is, it is vital to understand what they believed. I will just briefly touch upon the gods of the Sumerians here as a background reference only. I will also tell some of the ancient secrets that have been hidden from modern scholars and scientists until now. Not wanting to bore the average atheistic reader or the average ignorant modern scientist or to horrify the average religious reader, this will be just a short survey. It is important to have an idea of the religion of the Sumerians of ancient times and their various gods so that you are not deceived by the lies of the Jews or by the idiocy of the modern scientists. Firstly, the Sumerians had an intimate knowledge of the human aura. In more recent times, this spiritual radiation is often seen in old paintings of saints and gods. There's an image here. Let me uninvert my colors. What looks like the Iron Cross, and this is of course inscribed on a clay tablet, and what looks like a leaf or a tree And some circles and whatnot. Continuing. The human aura can be seen in others only by those who already perceive it in themselves. One of the earliest symbols for this radiant energy is found in what is today known as the Maltese Cross. The Maltese Cross represents a man or woman standing with outstretched arms with their holy aura glowing from off their body. I mean, like, almost exactly like an Iron Cross. This is what it looks like here. The Maltese Cross occurred as a religious symbol as early as the Jemdet Nasr period. Jemdet Nasr period, 2900 BC, in precisely the form in which it is met with in Christian art. Although the later Christians would accept this ancient design as a symbol of the cross, its representation of the radiance of the human spirit was recognized by the Sumerians 3,000 years before Jesus taught about the Holy Spirit. The Sumerians could radiate and perceive their personal auras, so it was not a great leap of faith to realize that their gods were similarly endowed. Okay, I understand now. The other one isn't a leaf. It's more like a pyramid. There's a separate image down here now, and so the Maltese Cross has a man with his arms spread out on each side, and then the pyramid, or what I thought was a leaf, there's a woman and her arms are at her sides. As the ancient people knew, the very most important of the 8 essentials of life is air to breathe. Without air, men die in only a few minutes. The gods themselves, as living gods, obviously also had to breathe. So the most important of all the gods was the god of the air, the god of the living breath, the god whose breath permeated the universe and gave life to gods and men. From the earliest records, Enlil, Enlil, is known as the father of the gods, the king of heaven and earth, the king of all the lands. Kings and rulers boasted that it was Enlil who had given them the kingship of the land, who had made the land prosperous for them, who had given them all the lands to conquer by his strength. It was Enlil who pronounced the king's name and gave him his scepter and looked upon him with a favorable eye. When we analyze the hymns and myths, we find Enlil glorified as a most friendly, fatherly deity who watched over the safety and well-being of all humans and, particularly, of course, over the inhabitants of Sumeria. The deep veneration of the Sumerians for the god Enlil and his temple, the Ekur, in Nippur, Ekur in Nippur, can be sensed in a hymn which reads in part as follows, quote, Enlil, whose command is far-reaching, whose word is holy, the Lord whose pronouncement is unchangeable, who forever decrees destinies, whose lifted eye scans the lands, whose lifted beam searches the heart of all the lands, Enlil, who sits broadly on the white dais, on the lofty dais, who perfects the decrees of power, lordship, and princeship, the earth gods bow down in fear before him, the heaven gods humble themselves before him. The city, Nippur, its appearance is fearsome and awesome. The unrighteous, evil oppressor, the informer, the arrogant, the agreement violator, he does not tolerate their evil in the city. The great net, he does not let the wicked and evildoer escape its meshes. And that ends the quote. Such goodness and positive virtue among the Sumerians belies the slanders and imprecations of the lying rabbis toward these ancient peoples. The Sumerians valued the righteous, the good, the trustworthy, the humble, and the honest, and they abhorred the wicked and the evildoer. Remember this because it has vital importance to this history. The Sumerians were a holy and virtuous people. The gods preferred the ethical and moral over the unethical and immoral, according to the Sumerian sages. Practically all the major deities of the Sumerian pantheon are extolled in their hymns as lovers of the good and the just, of truth and righteousness. Indeed, there were several deities who had the supervision of the moral order as their main function. For example, the sun god, Utu, U-T-U, who was later named Shamash. Another deity, the Lagash goddess named Nanshi, N-A-N-S-H-E, also played a significant role in the sphere of man's ethical and moral conduct. She is described in one of her hymns as the goddess, quote, "Who knows the orphan, who knows the widow, knows the oppression of man over man, is the orphan's mother, Nanshi, who cares for the widow, who seeks out justice for the poorest. The queen brings the refugee to her lap, finds shelter for the weak. Heaven was an abyss, earth was an abyss." This not only supersedes the Old Testament plagiarisms of the Jews by more than 3,000 years, but also shows an understanding of the universe that is in no way less advanced than the latest modern theories and observations of astrophysics. Indeed, the universe truly is a great abyss. Oh man, I messed up. She is just, so back to Nanshi. Who knows the orphan, who knows the widow, knows the oppression of man over man, is the orphan's mother, Nanshi, who cares for the widow, who seeks out justice for the poorest. The queen brings the refugee to her lap, finds shelter for the weak. These pages are written in columns, 2 per page, and there's a quote, like the one I just finished, right below it, and it's actually the next page. So, after that quote, it continues, "And so, these wicked evildoers are listed in the Sumerian literature as the unrighteous evil oppressors, the informer, malicious gossip, the arrogant, the agreement violator, the oppressor of orphans and widows, the oppressor of the poor and the weak, the refugee from war." In other words, what the religious scriptures of the Sumerians preached was goodness. Once again, the actual words of the Sumerians show what slandering liars the rabbis are, as they have vilified these people throughout history. Although the Sumerians recognized that their gods had certain physical attributes, or that they were represented by special totems or symbols, none of these gods were as puny and weak and non-existent as the modern Jewish historians make them out to be. Rather, the gods of the Sumerians were powerful and all-pervading. The slanders that are used by the Jewish writers are bald attempts to make the Jewish God appear to be mighty and the gods of other people to appear as myths or as cows or as crescent moons. But the gods of the Sumerians were actually more powerful and certainly no less powerful than the god that the Jews later claimed for their own. The Sumerian god Enlil, who is described in the cuneiform scripture as Enlil, to bring forth the seed of the land from the ground, hastened to separate heaven from earth, hastened to separate earth from heaven. The seed of the ground was humankind as well as the growing plants. On other tablets it is written that heaven was created of its own accord, earth was created of its own accord. Heaven was an abyss, earth was an abyss. This not only supersedes the Old Testament plagiarisms of the Jews by more than 3,000 years, but also shows an understanding of the universe that is in no way less advanced than the latest modern theories and observations of astrophysics. Indeed, the universe truly is a great abyss. The earth was a great abyss before mankind populated it, and it is still today huge in comparison to the size of man. It did not take a telescope orbiting in space for the Sumerians to understand this. Just as human beings build civilization using a division of labor within a social hierarchy, so too did the Sumerians envision their gods as having similar attributes. Thus, there was not one all-powerful god who did all the work of maintaining the universe, but rather there were multitudes of various gods who did their own work while being under the rule of one supreme god. Much as human society functioned with kings and priests, giving orders to their subalterns, who in turn passed along these orders to those lower on the hierarchy, so too did the gods of the Sumerians operate. In the 3rd millennium BC, a canonical list of the gods totaled almost 2,000 gods. Later, the Sumerians estimated that there were 3,600 gods, 60 times 60, but they were not as weak and non-existent as the Jews claimed them to be. The holy family of the gods all descended from the sky god, Anu, A-N-U, controls the heavens and is above everything. His holy city was Uruk, U-R-U-K. He had 2 consorts, Ki, Enki, and Namu, Nammu. With his consort, Ki, the earth goddess, they produced Enlil, the air god whose holy city was Nippur. Nippur was also the holy city of Ninlil, the air goddess. Enlil and Ninlil produced Nana, Nanna, later called Sin, Sin, the moon god, whose holy city was Ur, Ur. The other consort of the sky god was Namu, the goddess of the watery deep. They produced Enki, Enki, the god of wisdom and the god of eternally flowing waters. His city was Eridu. His consort, the reed lady Ningikuga, Ningikuga, produced Ningal, Ningal. The moon goddess was holy city, whose holy city was also Ur. So the moon god and the moon goddess both took up residence in the temples of Ur. From their union was produced Shamash, the sun god, whose holy cities were both Sippar and Larsa, and Inanna, the goddess of love, whose holy city was Uruk. Thus Uruk boasted the great temples to the highest god, Anu, and the goddess of love, Inanna, later known as Ishtar. The sun god, Shamash, in his daily course across the heavens, dispelled all darkness and could see all the works of man. Thus, by being the one from whom no secrets are hid, he was also the god of justice. And it is he who was later portrayed on the stela of Hammurabi as symbolically handing over the just laws to that king. Shamash, the god of justice, is commonly represented with the rod and ring, denoting straightness and completeness. That is, righteousness and justice. Other deities occasionally carry the rod and cord ring, showing that they too represented righteousness and justice. The principal cities with which Shamash was associated were Sippar and Larsa. Anu was the most ancient sky god and originally the chief of all the gods, but over the millennia his attributes had been absorbed by Enlil and later by Marduk, Marduk, in Babylon, and even later by Ashur, Asshur, in Assyria. Inanna was the Sumerian goddess of love and later became Ishtar to the Semites, represented by the planet Venus as the goddess of love and the goddess of war. In their well-organized heavenly government, there was a patron deity for every profession, such as a god of brick-making and a god of brewing. Dumuzi, Dumuzi, was a god of dates and date palms and a shepherd god to whom the date farmers gave devotion. Ansud, Ansud, was a grain goddess. Enbilulu, Enbilulu, was a god of the rivers. Enkimdu, Enkimdu, was a farmer god. Geshtinana was the goddess of the grapevine and of winemaking. Gibel, Gibil, was a god of fire to whom metalsmiths prayed. Gula, Gula, was the goddess of medicine and physicians. Haya was the god of the storehouse. Kabata was the god of mud bricks and of brick makers. Lahar was a cattle god. Nanshi was the goddess of fish and birds and was beseeched by the fishermen. Shakan was the god of goats, gazelles, and wild asses, to whom hunters would give offerings. Sumugan, Sumugan, was also a god of wild animals and cattle to whom the herdsmen prayed. Utu was the goddess of clothing to whom weavers and garment makers offered prayers. Sin was the moon god, who moved in the mysterious darkness and was the patron deity of the merchant moneylenders. The moon god was considered to be more powerful than the sun god because the moon can be seen both in day and in the night. So the sun god was born to the moon god and moon goddess. But above them all was the sky god, Anu, to whom all things under heaven and earth bowed because his command was the fountain of heaven and earth. And as the ultimate source of all authority, Anu was associated with the king, the highest authority on earth, whom he designated as ruler. It should be noted here that the Sumerians practiced something which gave them great bliss and spiritual knowledge through the meditation technique of the mantra. Through the repetition of the name of God in this manner, on, the Sumerian priests and people found both spiritual sustenance and food for the soul. They found peace and tranquility of mind and happiness in the heart. and so the name of the original god of mankind was Anu, and certainly not Jehovah. Also, this An mantra is used to this very day as the Om syllable. In this manner, Om, 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 Om. Try it, and you will like it. God is no farther away than the repetition of his name, and though he has many names, more is the pity for those who do not know even one of them. But such are the modern-day politicians, financiers, and Jews. The undisputed religious center of Sumeria was the city of Nippur, where Enlil's temple of Akur was located. Akur was the paramount shrine in all of Sumeria, and tradition points to Nippur as the place of assembly for the election of the supreme ruler. The king was nominated for office by his own city god in an assembly of gods meeting at Nippur. These gods were represented by the chief priests from the temples of Sumeria. Nippur was never directly involved in the petty squabbles that characterized the relationships between the other cities of Sumeria, nor was it the titular capital of any dynasty. But possession of the holy city of Nippur entitled a Babylonian king to adopt titles that implied at least theoretical hegemony over the country. This power over kings was later usurped by Babylon and its god Marduk. The Sumerians were a happy people, and the bliss and joy they found in worshipping their gods clearly shows on the statues of their priests and worshippers, who all wear smiles of bliss and have eyes filled full of awe. But there was a great evil rampant in the land of the two rivers. This evil was intent upon changing the contented smiles and awe-filled eyes of these first civilized people into grimaces of hard labor and eyes full of tears. This evil was found in the hearts of those who practiced the Sumerian swindle. Next subchapter, the temple. The temple. Most of the propaganda that you hear in modern times about the paganism and primitive religious sensibilities of the ancient peoples are mere slanders by the Jews and their Christian flunkies and the maniac Muslims. The Jews always slander and belittle all other religions in order to make the dwarfish Jews appear great. Giving other religions a bad name is one of the basic Talmudic teachings of the rabbis. By destroying the truth in all other religions, the rabbis try to make the lies of Judaism triumphant, and the Christians merely express their arrogance and Jewified stupidity by following the Jewish example, as do the Muslims. Both the Christians and the Muslims are guilty of the genocide of what they refer to as pagan cults. So, whether the archaeologists are Jews, Christians, or Muslims, they all have an inherent and biased defect in their understanding of what they dig up in the 5,000-year-old cities of Mesopotamia. Although they themselves are godless and atheistic perverts, modern scientists scoff at the ancient peoples who worshipped toward images of their gods, calling them idol worshippers. These blind fools have no god and no belief of their very own. Instead, the scientists idolize themselves and worship themselves alone in the belief that they are their own gods and need nothing outside of their own conceit. But an ancient person humbly worshipping at the feet of a statue and adoring the god within that statue is certainly far superior to a modern scientist or atheist who worships his own image in a mirror. For these reasons, modern people are misinformed about the actual cultural value of newly discovered artifacts. Many of these artifacts have been on museum display since Assyriology was first officially established as a science in 1812 AD, and the scientists of today still do not know what some of those artifacts represent. This is not surprising when the scientists themselves are either Jews who want to tear down all religions except their own, or Muslims and Christians who want to elevate their own religion above all others, or merely scientists who are atheists and blind to the religious experience and to religious expression in general. So, we must take a fresh look at some of the secrets that have been purposely hidden or ignorantly misperceived for so many centuries by those lying Jews, deluded Christians, and maniac Muslim scholars, quote-unquote. For a Sumerian, the temple was the center of Sumerian society, quite simply because God was the center of Sumerian society. The Sumerians did not pray to some wind god or fire god, as the modern scientists and the Jews would have you believe, but rather they were praying to God himself, the highest power of which they could conceive. These gods appeared to the Sumerian people in the wind or the fire or whatever physical manifestation seemed imbued with holy power. But they did not pray to the wind or the fire. They prayed to the God who was within the wind and the fire. A prayer here. O Shamash, King of heaven and earth, judge above and below, light of the gods, guide of mankind, who judges the cases of the great gods, I turn to you, seek you out. Such prayers to the sun god transmit through the millennia the heartfelt and fervent piety of these people. They were praying to God, but the Jews and the ignorant Christians and Muslims would have you believe that these people were praying to the sun. Shamash, the sun god, rises and sets every day, but his power was not restricted merely to an orb in the sky because Shamash radiated to all parts of heaven and earth. It is a great defect in modern perceptions to take the dull scientific view that the sun is an exploding sphere of nuclear gases held together by its own gravity. A scientist may say this and then brush aside the fantastically amazing reality of the blindingly immaculate sun by his explanation. But his explanation would not make Shamash any less awesome. Modern people are being misled by science if they throw away the wonderfulness of our universe only to accept the boringly dull descriptions of science. With your own eyes, you can see the amazing wonder of the sun. Why ignore this incredible beauty and power by sticking your head into a scientific textbook explanation? The mystical view of the universe is observed through your own mind, heart, and soul, the most subtle, insightful, and precise of instruments, and not through a telescope. If the Sumerians were farmers, they prayed to a storm god because it was upon the rain clouds that their crops and herds depended, and it was from the wind and storms that their crops could be destroyed and their herds scattered. Because the storm god also delivered his water by the rivers, then the water god was also vitally important. And of course, one couldn't very well ignore the sun god because only with his all-seeing eye could the world be illumined and the crops grow. So, the people pray to these manifestations of our great and beautiful world because everything in creation is essential to one's life and prosperity and happiness, just as it is today. Everything in creation is holy. The entire universe is holy, for it is a pristine masterpiece of perfection, exquisite in every atom. So, without help from the gods, man is nothing. The Sumerians did not have modern scientists telling them that they were ignorant fools for believing in non-existent gods, because the Sumerians could see with their own eyes the beauty and majesty of the holy sun rising above another day of life for them. They could smell the sweet nectar of the air, and they could feel the buoyant and silken majesty of the water, and they could feel their own spiritual life force radiating as an aura around them. They had no communist Jews telling them that they were nothing but animals because the Sumerians could see with their own eyes the human spiritual radiance within the love of their wives and the laughter of their children. They could see the holy aura radiating from their holy men and priests. And when the spirit left the body of a loved one at death, they could see it hovering about and returning to either haunt or to console them. Our modern scientists are the real fools who blindly cannot observe and appreciate these things that are evident even to a child. Beneath the great sky, the Sumerians were a happy people. The fertile plains of Sumeria gave them food, the mud bricks of the earth and the reeds of the marshes gave them shelter. With hard work and the blessings of the gods for good crops, good cattle, and good health, then and only then could they and their families and their gods be well supplied with everything. They depended upon the blessings of their gods, and their gods depended upon the offerings and prayers of their people. As long as they served their gods by working in the fields, fishing in the rivers, hunting on the outback, and offering a portion of their work to the gods through the priests of the temples, the Sumerians experienced the fullness of life. Sumeria was a happy land, and the Sumerians were, in general, a happy people. And why not? They had, in abundance, everything that life has to offer. They were blessed by the gods, and they knew it, and other people knew it, too. Other people who lived in the rocky terrain or in the desert wastes knew how fertile and bountiful was Sumeria, and they coveted that food-filled land. Because of the discoveries of modern archaeology, we can throw aside the Jewish lies that the ancient peoples were evil sinners just because they didn't pray to a Jewish God who hated them. All of the slanders that the rabbis wrote about them in the Old Testament are proven false by the cuneiform texts that the Mesopotamians have left us as records of their histories and their very thoughts. If they made an idol of their sun god in a temple, it was no more or less of an idol than the idol that the Jews make of their Torah scroll, which they adore and kiss and march around all dressed up in tapestries with a crown on its head. The lies that the Jews told about these religious people are easily proved to be lies by the prayers of the Mesopotamian peoples themselves. This prayer to the sun god is just as valid as any prayer offered up by Christians or Muslims today. Quote, O Shamash, judge of heaven and earth, who establishes light for the people, Shamash, when you set, light is withdrawn from the people. When you come forth, all mankind becomes warm, the cattle and living things that go out on the steppe land. They come towards you, you give them life. You judge the case of the wronged man and wronged woman. You give them a just decision. You take care of all people of the lands. Everything that Ea, the king, the counselor, has brought into being is wholly entrusted to you. Whatever has breath, you shepherd equally. You are their keeper, above and below. You give the crooked judge experience of prison, the person who perverts justice for a bribe. You make to bear punishment. He who does not accept a bribe, but takes the part of the weak, is pleasing to Shamash, who will give him long life. Such prayers tell us of the devotion and love these people had in their hearts, but they also tell us something about certain criminals who ravaged their societies. The crooked judge, the lawyer who perverts justice for a bribe, were very much a part of Sumerian society because they have always been here, quote unquote. And because they have always been here, we in modern times must learn from history and root them out entirely. Such prayers as these identify crooks in high places. At the same time, their prayers prove the ethical foundation of the priests and temples. There were no lying rabbis telling them to choose neither good nor evil, but to choose the self-serving desires of their atheist lusts. The Sumerian priests could see very clearly the good and evil in men and preached against those who took advantage of the poor and the weak. The temples were places of solace and refuge. However, one must not assume that the ancient Sumerians had the idea that their god would save them in a heavenly paradise after death in exchange for the service and devotion of the suppliant. Such ideas would have to await the Aryan Hindu and Aryan Buddha and the Celtic Druidic ideas and the teachings of Jesus several thousand years later. For the Mesopotamian, who saw the purpose of life to be only as a servant of the gods, what afterlife there was for him was nothing but the gloom of the underworld. And so they made the most of every single day, both with joyful appreciation and with deep prayer. They did not view their gods as being particularly bounded to moral justice because gods could do what they wanted. As a servant of the gods, mortal man was of no significance, and so personal ambition and personal greed were accepted as legitimate character traits. But these traits were to be tempered with morality and goodness and honesty, because this was how the gods wanted their people to be, followers of justice, of the straight way. Always among all of the ancient peoples there were priests. Perhaps they did not start their careers as priests, but they became priests nevertheless. Sitting around a fire at night, contemplating the stars, or perhaps offering wise counsel to their fellows, certain people became respected through their wisdom and advice. Or perhaps looking into the future and wondering about the coming season's prosperity, and calculating the moon phases and star crossings, gave them a certain skill for helping their people prepare for the proper times for sowing and planting. Some people became priests merely because they could see the futility of pursuing any other occupation, since wealth and power are temporary while infinite time and space are immortal. And against infinite time and the temporary nature of life, what other help does mankind have other than that from the gods? And what better way to understand eternity and to help the people than to be a priest? Modern scientists may scoff as they are being shoveled into their graves, but the ancient people discovered something amazing about a life devoted to realization of Godhead. The discoverers of these mysteries were the priests who maintained the temples of the gods, and the beneficiaries of these mysteries were the people themselves, who devoted their love and their lives to the gods. Beneath the starry skies, beneath the brilliant sun, upon the wide and beautiful earth, the ancient Sumerians asked the question, "What is the purpose of life?" And they realized the answer. The purpose of life is to serve God. And when they worked together toward that purpose, life became abundant and joyful to them. It was truly a wonderful mystery that such was so. One of the great discoveries of the Sumerians was that every man and woman could attain an actual realization of God. Certainly, they prayed and made sacrifice to their deities, but they also received solace in return. Like any modern religious person who feels good and holy through their daily genuflections. Let me look that up. The act of bending the knees in worship or reverence, genuflection. Like any modern religious person who feels good and holy through their daily genuflections and prayers, so too did the Sumerians feel the bliss and confidence that comes to those who fulfill their duties in the service of God. No atheist or agnostic can understand the peaceful bliss that is experienced when certainty of God enters a person's heart. Ancient Mesopotamians believed that man was created to serve the gods. This principle was interpreted literally, so the idols of the gods were cared for, fed, and clothed. They expressed their adoration of the god by serving the image of the god. The temple administration included the chief priest, various kinds of exorcists, singers, musicians, scribes, and the staff who supervised the temple businesses. According to a detailed text from the much later Seleucid period, although certainly valid also for Sumerian times, the divine statues in the temple of Uruk were served 2 meals daily. The first meal was served in the morning when the temple opened, and the other was served at night, immediately before the doors of the sanctuary were closed. Each meal included 2 courses, called main and second. From descriptions of divine meals, the following sequence can be reconstructed. First, a table was placed before the image, water for washing offered in a bowl. Even the gods had to wash up before eating. Then a variety of beverages, special cuts of meat, and fruits were brought to the table. When the gods ate, they were hidden from both priests and the common people. Whatever was left over, in no way different from the hypocritical Jewish rabbis, the priests and their families would eat. The modern-day atheists may scoff, but they do not understand that this religious ritual was not simply a means of providing a physical service to an imaginary god. Rather, the physical service was provided as a means of devotion to a spiritual God. Just as man is a physical being who houses a Holy Spirit within him, he uses a physical representation of his God to serve as a house and a resting place for his God. Thus, the statues and images of the various ancient peoples were never believed to be the actual God himself. These images were physical places into which the gods were believed to enter. So, an ancient person would look at the image of a god and know that that god was inside of that image looking out at him. To the ancient people, the gods were real. To modern people, the gods are imaginary. But since modern people cannot even see something as simple and commonplace as their own divine and holy spirits, their own chi, how can they expect to understand God? Modern people have been led astray. By whom? You shall learn. But whether or not you believe that a god actually lived inside of the statues doesn't matter any more than whether you believe that God created the world in 6 days. If you want to understand the ancient people, what you believe doesn't matter. What the ancient people believed is all that matters. And it is their beliefs that shaped their history and their culture, not your beliefs. No less than modern man, they asked themselves the grand questions of life. The results of their philosophical ponderings were written in cuneiform classics such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh Gilgamesh was first written onto clay tablets at the turn of the second millennium, or earlier, around 2000 BC. It was popular among the Sumerians, as well as later among the Babylonians, Assyrians, Hittites, and Hurrians, who no doubt read it to the illiterate and numerous other peoples of the Near East. The epic itself, of course, much older. For generations, the folk memory of the Sumerian people passed along poems and stories by word of mouth. Only after many generations were such stories preserved by poets in written form. These poems contained great wisdom. The great problems of mankind were cited and pondered, and wise conclusions were attained for the mysteries of life, death, and the hereafter. That the Epic of Gilgamesh was a popular poem is attested by the numerous fragments of copies scattered all over the Fertile Crescent region and beyond. Thus, this ancient refrain from the Epic of Gilgamesh is often repeated in the literature of all peoples. Gilgamesh opened his mouth, saying to Enkidu, "Who, my friend, can scale heaven? Only the gods live forever under the sun. As for mankind, numbered are their days. Whatever they achieve is but the wind." Man, how long is this chapter? So on page 39. This ends on 42. Starting to get a little wore out here. Alright, close enough. Go ahead and finish it up. Do these words sound familiar to those of you who have read the Bible or the Dhammapada or the Bhagavad Gita? These are the observations of the wise men of all peoples. These longings, these hopes that life is not a passing phase, never to return, but is merely one step in an eternal procession, were thoughts written down by many peoples who were far older than the lying, perfidious Jews. Shamash was distraught as he betook himself to him. He says to Gilgamesh, "Gilgamesh, whither rovest thou? The life thou pursuest, thou shalt not find. Gilgamesh says to him, to valiant Shamasha, "After marching and rowing over the steppe, must I lay my head in the heart of the earth, that I may sleep through all the years? Let mine eyes behold the sun, that I may have my fill of the light. Darkness withdraws when there is enough light. May one who indeed is dead behold yet the radiance of the sun." Do these themes not sound familiar to you readers of the Old Testament? The writer of the Ecclesiastes was familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh, as is reflected numerous times in Ecclesiastes 2:24 and in 5:18, 8:15, and in 9:8 through 10, and the epic continues. Siduri, the tavern keeper, said to Gilgamesh, "Gilgamesh, whither rovest thou? The life thou pursuest, thou shalt not find. When the gods created mankind, death for mankind they set aside, life in their own hands retaining. Thou, Gilgamesh, let full be thy belly, make thou merry by day and by night. Of each day make thou a feast of rejoicing, day and night dance thou and play. Let thy garments be sparkling fresh, thy head be washed, bathe thou in water. Pay heed to the little one that holds on to thy hand. Let thy spouse delight in thy bosom, for this is the task of mankind." And as in Ecclesiastes 2:16 and 9:5, so too in Gilgamesh. "Since the days of yore, there has been no permanence. The resting and the dead, how alike they are. Do they not compose a picture of death, the commoner and the noble, once they are near to their fate?" As the expressions of their sincere devotion and piety, the Sumerians built great temples to their gods in all of their cities. These rectangular temples were constructed of mud bricks and decorated with gold and silver and precious stones. They built high ziggurats ziggurat towers of 3 levels with the god's house at the top, and all of it enclosed by the walls of the temple grounds. That the temples were the largest and tallest buildings in a Mesopotamian city very significantly indicates that the most important and most powerful persons in those ancient societies were the priests, who served their gods of creation and their gods of the universe. This is an identical correlation in the modern Western societies of the 20th and 21st centuries AD. However, in all of the modern cities today, the biggest and tallest buildings in a city are not the temples or churches. The biggest and tallest buildings are owned by the bankers and moneylenders. The banks are presided over by the mighty dwarfs of finance who serve their gods of money. Those who bow to the gods are servants of the gods. Those who bow to money are betrayers of the gods. The ancient people followed the example of their priests, while modern people follow the example of their greedy bankers. As you shall see, whether your life leads through heaven or hell depends upon whom you follow as your leader. Because the Sumerians devoted their lives to serving the gods, the temples were more than mere places of worship. Since the purpose of life was to serve the gods, every aspect of life was an act of service and devotion to God. So, the temples were also centers of manufacture and trade. As the estates of the gods, the temple grounds were where the business of a vibrant society was transacted. Temples were places of worship, as well as places for doing business and conducting trade. The temples managed the cultivation of grain and vegetable and fruit trees. The temple shepherds took care of the herds of sheep, goats, and cattle. Inside of the temple grounds and in outlying cottages, the temple staff supervised a spinning and weaving industry. Cloth, clothing, leather, wooden, and pottery objects were all manufactured for use by the temples, both on the temple grounds and in outlying properties. These goods were used for domestic and foreign trade, and for all of these activities, storerooms, granaries, workshops, and living quarters were acquired. Because of their profits from manufacturing and trade, as well as being the beneficiaries of the goods and properties bequeathed to them from pious devotees, the temples grew in wealth and in landed property. They were not only the center for their lives of the Sumerian peoples, but were their nurturing and protecting element as well. In times of famine, the temples gave interest-free loans of grain to the people. The temples provided a refuge for orphans and illegitimate children. Parents who were being hounded by the moneylenders could sell their beloved children to the temple for service to God, rather than sell them to the moneylenders as lifelong slaves and prostitutes. In addition to the main temple in the city, every town and village had its own small sanctuaries. Every house had its own little alcove that housed a statue or a talisman of the family god. Along the roads, the canals, and the thoroughfares were wayside shrines where a farmer or boatman could pause for a quick blessing from the god, and where merchants and travelers could ask for divine protection or to offer thanks for a safe return. Without doubt, and with all certainty, the people of Mesopotamia were a religious people. They were not the knaves and the lying Jews and ignorant Christians and maniac Muslims claim that they were. They were a religious people who honored the gods and who lived their lives as nobly as they could. To understand the power and wealth that the Sumerian people enjoyed, you cannot use money as a measure of wealth. Money, as you will see, is mainly, though not entirely, a fraudulent delusion. It is better to understand the goods that money can buy, since these goods are no different today than they were 5,000 years ago. A cow is a cow, no matter if you can buy one for a penny or for $1,000. And even though a tiny dab of silver no larger than a barley corn means no more to a modern person than a handful of paper money would have meant to a Sumerian, a cow is still a cow today, just as it was in ancient times. The cow is no different, only the money that it takes to buy the cow is different. If a Mesopotamian worker of 3000 BC could fill his stomach for a penny's worth of barley porridge bought from a roadside shop, while a modern office worker pays $10 for the same sized bowl of porridge bought from a fancy restaurant, both the ancient man and the modern man are filled up on a bowl of porridge and are satisfied. The bowl of porridge is no different, only the amount of money to purchase them is different. How can anyone say that a copper penny is less valuable than a paper $10 bill if they both can only buy the same bowl of porridge? Physical things are constant, while money is as variable as a mirage. Be careful. The Sumerian swindle is at work here. I will repeat these arguments later, but it will be useful to you to begin thinking about these concepts now. Modern people are being swindled out of their physical goods in exchange for a mirage. To get an idea of the scale of wealth that flowed through Mesopotamia in 3000 BC, let's look at just the food that was required by a Sumerian temple in just one day. The enormous amounts of food were provided to temple administrators and craftsmen. For example, one text listed a daily total of more than 500 kilograms of bread, 40 sheep, 2 bulls, 1 bullock, 8 lambs, 70 birds and ducks, 4 wild boars, 3 ostrich eggs, dates, figs, raisins, and 54 containers of beer and wine, in addition to other offerings. The best agricultural products and the best food animals were sent to the temple, to be used in 3 different ways: as daily food served to the divine image, as income or rations for the temple staff who supervised and prepared the divine meals, and as savings accumulated for future use or for trade. The temple also relied on funds supplied by the royal house, by wealthy citizens, and occasionally from shares of war booty. The temple represented the communal identity of each city. The temple was usually located in the center of the city and was both the largest and tallest building in the city. Until recently, it was generally believed that in the early Sumerian period, the temple owned all the land of the city-state. But it has now been shown that the temple share amounted to perhaps no more than 1/8 of the whole. The rest of the land was owned by families or clans collectively, and could only be sold by agreement of all the prominent members of the family or clan. The buyers of such land would be members of what was becoming the ruling class or nobility, and these people thereby came to own land as private property, in addition to what they held as family property. Their lands were worked by poor landless freemen. In a normal society, there are 4 general classes or castes. This social pyramid is formed by the priests at the top who guide society. They are followed by the king and administrators who serve and protect society. These are served by the merchants and traders, while all of society is supported by the farmers and laborers. These 4 classes make up society. That is, these 4 classes make up all normally evolving societies. Originally, this too was the normal and natural arrangement in Mesopotamian society in its earliest stages. The natural order was clearly observable within the earliest archaeological record, but was later sublimated behind a superimposed wealth factor. At a very early stage, this wealth factor began to corrupt the natural order of society. As money flowed into their coffers through the Sumerian swindle, and as their wealth increased, this normally evolving human society of priest, king, merchant, and farmer devolved instead to the beginnings of what we have today in modern society. The corrupted system of society that we have today is composed of banker, merchant, politician, and slave. This corruption was not apparent to the Sumerians any more than it has been apparent to the modern archaeologists, because it evolved so slowly and insidiously that the Sumerians didn't notice the subtle changes. It has been overlooked by the modern archaeologists simply because it has always been here, and so modern society also suffers under the perverse criminals who operate the Sumerian swindle today, the bankers, the merchants, and the financial speculators, most of whom are Jews. Sumeria's entire social structure became based on ownership. Sumerian society was divided into 2 groups: those who owned property, especially land, and those who were dependent upon the wealthy, the awalim, haves, and the muskanim, have-nots. Thus, from a very early time in the earliest history of civilization, a perversion occurred in the natural order of mankind, and this perversion was carried along through successive eras in an accepted practice simply because it has always been here. While the ancient people were serving their gods in the temples, and while the priests and kings were serving their gods and nurturing their people throughout the country, and while society was evolving normally and joyfully, in the dark and dismal mud brick houses of the moneylenders, the great evil of the Sumerian swindle arose, secretly, with only the moneylenders profiting from the destruction of the people. Ancient Egypt. We will study more about ancient Egypt in later chapters, but to focus on the theme of this book, a short mention is here in order. Many modern people assume that Egypt is older than Mesopotamia. This is due to the fact that the ancient Egyptians built with enduring stone, while the Sumerians and Babylonians built with mud bricks. So, Egyptian tombs and monuments are still present today, while the mud brick temples and palaces of ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, and Assyria are little more than mounds of dirt. Also, the high water table in Sumeria destroyed all organic evidence, while the drier conditions of Egypt preserved even hair, bone, and linens. The Egyptian civilization was old, but not as old as Sumeria. As the Ice Age declined and the earth warmed from its long winter, the vast grasslands of the Saharan plain, which had been a rich hunting ground that was filled with zebras, giraffes, and antelope, dried up and turned into desert. The dark-skinned peoples who had hunted these grasslands moved to more hospitable environs towards Central Africa, while the light-skinned people who had colonized the Mediterranean basin in North Africa moved to the fringes of the Mediterranean Sea and to the Nile Valley. By 2700 BC, 3 centuries after Sumerian culture had blossomed, the Old Kingdom period of Egypt began. As isolated as Egypt was, surrounded by inhospitable... We're almost done here, I promise. As isolated as Egypt was, surrounded by inhospitable deserts, 300 years is plenty of time for such inventions as writing and agriculture to spread to Egypt from Sumeria. The ideas spread, but not the culture that fostered them. So, Egypt evolved its own unique culture, though some of the ideas that it borrowed from Sumeria were ideas that grew into uniquely Egyptian expressions of them. There are 3 important differences between Sumeria and Egypt that should be noted. First, while the Sumerians believed that the king was the servant of the gods, the Egyptians believed that the king was himself a god incarnate. The Sumerians lived to serve the gods, while the Egyptians lived to serve the pharaoh. By serving the pharaoh, god incarnate, they served the gods. Second, in Sumeria, the lands originally belonged to the temple to be worked in service to the gods. In Egypt, the lands and all of Egypt belonged to Pharaoh. And third, the Egyptians never made use of a money system. At least it wasn't a money system that could be manipulated by greedy merchants. All business and services in Egypt were accomplished through barter and food rations. Workers were paid in rations of grain and oil and cloth. The only markers that could be used as a sort of money were scarabs. And since these carved dung beetles were not made of precious metals, they couldn't be falsified by weight or mixed with base metals. They were simply tally scarabs, allowing their exchange for a ration payment. Thus, they had local but not international value. Money tends to free people to more easily trade the necessities of life among themselves. Barter tends to restrict people to a lifestyle that cannot be easily divorced from the land. For example, a rich farmer in Sumeria, after selling his grain for silver, could hide his silver under a rock. Thus, a huge pile of grain could be concealed by being turned into silver and then hidden. But a successful farmer in Egypt, after growing the same amount of grain as the Sumerian, needed to store his grain in a large storehouse where his wealth was easily observed by anyone. Barter tended to keep people tied to their land and to their crafts, since whatever they did for a living could only be turned into profit by trading for an equally bulky and heavy pile of trade goods. This tended to add to the Egyptians' isolation as a people because the limited travel that there was in those early days was not easily accomplished by people whose wealth was stored as bulky and heavy sacks of grain rather than relatively light and concealable purses of silver. Also, with barter, much more wealth can be concentrated at the top of the social pyramid, when a laborer's pay is in food rather than silver. A hungry worker is glad to have a handful of food as his pay, and is less likely to run away when his food is limited by how much grain he can carry. And when everyone gets the same ration of food or clothing, there is not much incentive for individual achievement, and so Egypt attained a high level of culture and a unique civilization, but its achievements leveled off after the first 1,000 years, because by then they had developed everything that they needed. Because of the relative security offered by its surrounding deserts, Egypt was able to enjoy a more peaceful cultural evolution than the constantly warring Mesopotamia. Sumeria was surrounded by a variety of different peoples that had no natural barriers against attack. So, Sumeria underwent far greater social changes over time than did Egypt. Culture always progresses during times of peace, so the several thousand years of peace that Egypt enjoyed found expression in everything from the pyramids and temples to the daily life of a happy and contented people. Thus, the religious and spiritual knowledge that most ancient people experienced was fostered in the peaceful lands of ancient Egypt. There, great religious mysteries were attained that were not equaled until the arrival of the Buddha and the Christ. Modern science has no knowledge or concept of what the ancient Egyptians had achieved on the religious and spiritual level. Knowledge of auras, the spiritual body, the dynamics of the bioelectric energy field, or chi, superhuman strength, out-of-body travel, meditational transcendence, and communion with God were all common knowledge to the Egyptian priests and people, though such knowledge is still a mystery to the hunchbacked and diseased modern scientists. These subjects are dealt with more thoroughly in How the Jews Betrayed Mankind, Volume 2, The Monsters of Babylon. Although Egypt was growing to the greatness for which it is justifiably famous, it was an isolated kingdom that had very little effect upon the early history of Mesopotamia. That being said, let's return to the history of Sumeria. And that concludes Chapter 4.